while we do the introductions. Brenda, you there?
Good morning. Um, I'd like to thank everyone for joining this morning. Some of you may have gotten 2 or 3 invites, but that just means that we really wanted you all to be here for this important information. Um, I don't have anything else to say other than I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Korthoff, and for the remainder of our hour, you're going to be in great hands. And I will tell you that the recording has already started, and we will get the presentation out to you all as soon as we can. So I'm turning the mic over to you, Lisa.
All right, great. Thanks, Brenda. There was a little interference while you were talking. I don't know if there was a problem with your microphone or not, but you might want to just check that. But hopefully you all can hear me real well. So let's go ahead and get started with our FISAP presentation. Just some reminders, some important things is that, the routine. You need to close your door and forward your phone. So we have your undivided attention for the next little bit. Stay engaged. Please mute yourself if you're not speaking. I don't hear anyone's microphone is on right now, so yay, you guys are off to a great start. If you are joining us by phone, please, if you will, do not put us on hold. I'm sure you have some lovely hold music, but it makes the presentation impossible to give. And we'll ask you for some feedback separately, I assume. I think Brenda likes to do that kind of thing. And we'll get to see if you like this kind of training or not. And then be sure to ask questions. We will have a period of time at the end of our presentation today where I'm going to go over some common questions. But then we're going to open it up to the rest of you to ask questions. So feel free to put those questions in the chat. Or at that time, you can turn on your microphone and we can hear from you with any questions you might have. And if we don't know the answers, Brenda and I will look them up and we will get back to you. So let's get started. So the FISAP report, for those, I know some of you are fairly new. I met some of you actually in the last couple days over there at the Cameron campus for the Financial Aid Leadership Academy. Some of you are new to the profession and may not have filled out a FISAP before. I've actually been filling them out for 34 years now. And so I'm pretty familiar with FISAP after all this time. But for those of you who are new, the FISAP stands for the Fiscal Operations Report and Application to Participate. So this is something we have to do every September in order to not only report on what we've spent, but to request campus-based funding for the next academic year that is to come. Our report this year is due October 1, and you would be accessing this from the COD website. If you go to cod.ed.gov and log in, you'll see after you place your college name in there, on the far left-hand side at the bottom, you'll see a link to campus-based funds, and that will take you to the FISAP site, and where you will not only fill it out, but you can print a copy of the form so you can work on it in pencil like I like to do before I submit it. And that's also then where you would submit it and print your signature pages for you and well, not for you, but for your president to complete. Some things you need to do before you get started on the actual FISAP is make sure you've reconciled all your funding for the 2021 year. I mean, this is just something you should be doing monthly. I know that's something here at GTCC we do, and it's something that our Eagle reporting and stuff, they like to look at and see that we've done a monthly reconciliation of our funding. But you especially need it right now, of course, because you want to report accurate figures. That also means that if you haven't voided any uncashed checks, if they are stale dated at this point, if they're beyond the date that they can be cashed anyways, then it would be time to go ahead and void these and get those cleaned up. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later if in fact that hasn't happened for you and what options you have. Also, for those of you with work study, in order for the reporting to show accurately, especially that income section for eligible work study and SEOG recipients, for the work study portion, you need to update that CWS earnings field on AIDE. If your payroll department posts to this field automatically, then you actually have to undo that temporarily so that you can get to that field if needed to update the figures that are in the CWS earnings field. At this point in time, that CWS earnings field should match your FWS award on AIDE. They should be the same figure, and so and those both should be, of course, accurate figures in terms of what you paid the student for the 2021 year. So make sure you do that. To temporarily take that payroll option offline so that you can get to that field, you would go to the FAAP screen and change the field maintain CWS earnings temporarily to a Y. Make your adjustments and then make sure you go back and change that back to a no. And that will then allow your payroll department to do that. Now, if your payroll department doesn't do that, then that field is probably already set to a Y on FAAP, and as such, then you can get to that field and make sure it gets updated if needed. There are some fields in the FISAP that are really areas that are not financial aid related per se. They are things that other departments on your campus, however, would know the answer to. For example, the first one is your unduplicated head count that it asks for in part 2. You would want to ask, now at my campus, that's the institutional research department that I would send an email to and ask for that figure for unduplicated head count. But it may be a different office on your campus that maintains that figure. You also can write your own query, either in colleague or in Informer. Just be sure that you are accounting in the directions for how and what people should be included in your unduplicated headcount when doing that. For things like your tuition and fees that were charged for the past year, at least at my campus, I ask my business office for that figure and they add that up. And I always send a detailed email about what that consists of. And what I do then is I copy paste parts of the FISAP directions that say how to calculate these two fields to those departments so that they know what they're supposed to be calculating on. And so here's just probably a little hard to read example, but you'll be able to see it fairly well in your printed or your electronic copy of the presentation. But this is an email that I send my business office every year that asks for the tuition and fee figures. And so that's just a sample you can use where you can see I've asked for the figure and then I've showed them how it should be calculated. All right, requesting campus-based funds. So, I said part of this FISAP is part of the application for to participate. So what you're doing with your reporting is you're justifying what you're going to, what you could possibly receive, and then requesting what you want. The formula to allocate campus-based funds, though, is very old. It dates back a few decades. And it was designed to favor the colleges that were in the program, in the Title IV programs, the earliest. So we're talking, the 60s. So if they were in that program back then, they were some of the early adopters, if you will, of Title IV, and they got the biggest share of campus-based funds because there weren't that many colleges that were participating to begin with. When they started changing the rules, these same colleges then lobbied Congress to make sure that they didn't lose out on some of that money as some of these new colleges came on, including those newfangled community colleges at that time, who served a greater number of low-income students. And so they got Congress to give them a base allocation. That base allocation then is historical. It's not based on any kind of reality in terms of what types of low-income students they serve or don't serve, as the case may be. And as such, then they still get a fair amount of those campus-based funds, and we get the leftovers as newer schools to the program. So the only thing you can do, unless we can get Congress to change these antiquated rules, is to make sure that you are not only asking for enough money on the application, but that you're justifying your need for it with accurate reported information on the FISAP. Well, I know I did this presentation last year, and I think I surprised a few people when I said that I always ask for $1 million each from work study and SEOG. So why do you do that, Lisa? Well, the first thing is they'll never give me $1 million. First of all, I know that won't happen, but I want to make sure I ask for enough If they were to give it to me, I know I'd find a way to spend it. That is not a problem. I have a lot of low income students, just like you guys do. And I could give, for SEOG, you can give up to $4,000 per student. And for work study, there's really not a limit. So I would find a way to give that away. But we have a high need population that can really use these funds. So we want to make sure that we don't lowball the Department of Education in our requests. So that's why I asked for $1 million. The problem is if you ask for what you think you really will get, then that is exactly what you will get, even if you qualify for more. So if you ask for $20,000 because you think that's all you're going to get, and you actually qualified for 25,000, you're going to get 20,000. So don't limit yourself. These funds can be very easy to administer. They're easy if you set up packaging in Colleague to do it for you. Here at GTCC, we have it set up to go to students with 0 EFCs and who apply by a certain date, who could file their FAFSA by that date. And I always run out of money even trying to serve that population. So I'm sure it's probably similar with most of you that you always have more eligible recipients, possible recipients than actual recipients. And so it can be quite easy to give away and have it done with. You also have some flexibility with these programs. If you've never taken advantage of it, you may have done so this past year given the national emergency, but you always have had the ability to transfer up to 25% between the SEOG and work study programs. So if you find you're underspending in one area and a need to spend more in another, or could spend more in another, then you can transfer up to 25% of your allocation between those. You also can transfer forward and back up to 10% of your award. And that's in addition to any summer expenditures. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And I know some schools prorate their SEOG, like they prorate their Pell and community college grants and their lottery and their long leaf commitment grant, but that is not required. So if you're doing that and you're finding it hard to spend your SEOG, you may want to consider not doing that. You'll find it's easier to give that money away, and it's a lot easier to not have to bill students or make adjustments to students if you're constantly having to having to worry about prorating yet another program that actually doesn't require you to do so. So something to think about. And might be something you think might make your life easier. You should probably consider it. If not, well, then certainly keep doing what you're doing. And there's no harm in doing that as well. So if we start getting into part 2, this is where we start doing a lot of our reporting that's going to justify how much money we actually qualify to get. In section D there, you've got your question 7, which is your unduplicated headcount. Again, we talked about where you're going to get that from, and those tuition and fee charges there are in question 22. And again, it should only be for those students who are part of your unduplicated headcount. So that's important to know. Section E, question 24, always raises questions because it's asking you about your state grant funding. And just know that while this question continues to be asked, there's no real use for it anymore. It used to be tied, like it says here, to that LEAP or that SLEEP funding. Back when we used to have the student incentive grant here in North Carolina, that was LEAP funding. But that's gone away. And it hasn't been funded by the Department of Education since, as you can see here, from the 2010-11 years. So it's been quite a while. Well, I said the asking for money was important, but these sections are pretty important too, and that's sections E and F. Again, we talked about that base guarantee, that basic allocation that you get. Anything above that is going to be justified by your answers to the tuition fees question, how much you've dispersed in Pell Grants, and your number of eligible aid applicants that are in this section. So it's real important to try to get these figures just as accurate as you can to make sure you get all the money that you're entitled to receive. So section F we talked about is an important section, and it can often be confusing. And as it states here, schools often make mistakes. So it should include only enrolled and eligible students for that year. I have seen schools put the eligible students and not checked for enrollment, for example, and vice versa. So that becomes a problem. You need enrolled and eligible students here on this. You get this report out of colleague by running it on EAAP. That's the screen. And like it says, you don't want to run this thing wide open. It's really best that you come up with some kind of query that will find your eligible and enrolled students. So these are students who filed a FAFSA and were enrolled, and then use that when running EAAP. Because if you run it wide open, you're going to end up having to check all your students, and none of us want to do that. That's too much work. So to try to generate that, you can use SLCR, although I'll admit I'm not any kind of a good hand at using that screen. I've never learned it very well. You can use RLPC by writing a rule on RLDE and then running it through RLPC to generate a list. Or if you're an informer guru, you can use that to create a query or get your IT department to write up a query for you to find the right students. So eligible aid applicants is a regular student who was enrolled in at least one credit of a Title IV eligible degree-seeking academic or training program. And this is an approved program listed on your e-car, or an approved program listed on your e-car. So it's either all your associate degree programs or it's one of your approved programs on your e-car. That they've met your citizenship and residency requirements for the academic year, and they applied for financial aid, and there's a FAFSA with an official EFC. So you can't count the students who have an invalid FAFSA. So it can only be those students with valid EFCs there. So if they're included, if they meet that criteria, they would be included, and you would include even those students you could not award. Maybe their EFC was too high, or maybe they didn't qualify because they were in default, for example. You still would include them in your eligible aid applicants. In this section, they ask about how many of these students, your eligible aid applicants, because you break it down by income, how many of those people had automatic zero EFCs calculated for them. This is important. These are students who would be considered your neediest students. So the more students you have in this category that received an auto zero EFC calculation, the more campus-based funds you may qualify to receive. So it's make sure that you don't give short shrift to this field. Make sure that it's accurate and you get that information from your EAAP report. But during the year, that's where you can actually make an impact on that figure that comes off on your report by making sure that you correct those fields when you're doing verification, when we have verification, that would impact whether or not the student qualifies for an auto zero EFC. Okay, and if you need to know how a student qualifies for an auto zero EFC, there's a really nice discussion about that in the federal handbook. Take a look at that section. Make sure you know that, for example, if the student earns over a certain amount of income, or if, and more importantly, and this is where you can have some impact, whether or not the student was eligible to file a short form or a long form or had a Schedule A now, which is now the consideration. Make sure that those answers are accurate to put this student in the right category. The other thing too, now once you get into part 4 and part 5, you're going to start reporting on how much funds you actually expended from the SEOG and work study programs. Make sure you're maximizing your funding. We talked about this a little bit, but I've re-emphasized it here just because I think it's really important for folks to know the flexibility they have. So again, just to reiterate, you can transfer up to 25% of your SEOG to work study and vice versa. You can transfer up to 10% of your SEOG to last year or next year. And you can also exceed your 10% transfer limit when expending funds for summer enrollment. So for example, your July payroll, even though that's part of the next school year, if you're still spending it out of the current year's funds, you can count that separately and separate and apart from your 10% that you need to carry forward. That July payroll, which is part of your summer enrollment, is just treated like any other enrollment or payment period then for the 2021 year, and is not subject to your 10% rollover calculation if you have leftover funds you want to move forward. Keep in mind, of course, all this is subject to your matching requirements. If you are a school that's required to match, I'm not sure I have a feel for how many of you have to match. We don't. But also look for exceptions to those rules, like during a national emergency, like what we're in right now. And again, we will talk more about that. And here's where we talk more about that. So be aware of special provisions due to the national emergency. There were quite a few things that came out of the CARES Act and that last March 2020, and things that were carried forward as a result of still being under a national emergency, which has not officially ended. So we are still considered part of, still in the national emergency. So these provisions are still in place, and there are many exceptions to things like your transfer limits, match requirements, and things like that. So be aware of what those are and take advantage of them if you need to. But be aware, the FISAP, of course, it's set up for one of those standard years that we typically have, and it's not set up to recognize the national emergency. So when you submit, for example, and we'll talk more about this, but that you didn't have any students doing community service under work study, you'll get an error saying you were supposed to spend 7%. Well, what you do is then in the comments section of the FISAP where you can explain these errors, you would make an explanation due to the national emergency and, as trying to avoid any COVID infections, we chose not to place students in community service jobs. So you put that in as your explanation, that overrides the error, and you move on with your life. So just be aware, though, you'll get some errors, but they really aren't errors. They're just ones that have to be explained due to the exceptions given because of the national emergency. So let's talk a little bit about matching requirements. Now, if you're a Title III eligible institution, like we are at GTCC, then you are not required to make a 25% match out of your own dollars towards these programs. Now, you can choose to do so, and you can choose to match more than 25% if you really want to, but that you're not required to. And so many colleges, because, again, as a Title III institution, that means you're an under-resourced college, you may not have the funding to do it, and so you don't match. So if you're a school that chooses not to match, be sure you know how to calculate the accurate amount of aid available to award during the school year so that you don't end up at the end of the year filling out your FISAP and you realize you've underspent, or worse, overspent your amount of your allocation. So if you're a school that's not required to match, this is the way I calculate it. And you all might have different ways, but as long as you come out with the right figure, that's all that really matters in the end. But what I do is I'll take my allocation figure from the Department of Education and I will divide that award by 1.05. And that will tell me how much I can spend on students. That's the figure I put on AWD in my budget for that year, so I know how much I can spend. Okay. So here's an example. If your authorization is 100,000 and you divide by 1.05, you get 95,238. That's how much you can award to students. That's the amount you put in your budget on AWD, so you don't overspend by mistake. And it's so you don't underspend as well. It'll always tell you where you're at. So to make sure that that figure is accurate, you prove your work. So you take your 95,238 and you multiply that by 5% to get your administrative allowance. Keep in mind your administrative allowance is 5% of what you spend on students. It's not necessarily 5% of your allocation unless you spent your allocation. So you calculate this by multiplying what you spent on students by 5%. So if you assume that you're going to spend the entire amount that you can, you get 4,762. If you add 95,238 to 4762, you come back to $100,000, which is the amount of your allocation. So the math works here. So here's an example for those schools who must match or who choose to match. This is how you would calculate then how much you have to spend on students, again, to make sure you either don't underspend or overspend on your award. So what you do is you take, this is how I do it. Again, if you might have a different method, but if it works, do it. I take the authorization, which in my example is 100,000, and I multiply it by 80%. That 80% represents the 75% federal match and the 5% administrative allowance. And when I do that, I get $125,000 is what I can spend on students. You take the 125 to prove your work, you multiply it by 75% to get 93,750. You take that 125 and multiply it by 25% to figure out what the school must match. This is a figure the school has to come up with. You figure out your administrative allowance based on what you plan to spend on students, which is 125,000. You add together your admin and your federal match amounts, and you'll come back to your original figure of 100,000. So that's how we calculate it at my school, and that may be how you calculate it at yours, or maybe you have a different way. But this will give you accurate figures so that you don't have any surprises when you get to FISAP time, because that is not the time to have an unpleasant surprise. All right, let's talk a little bit about COVID considerations. So, as you may be, I'm sure you're aware because you had this out, you had this last year. If you were doing FISAP last year, you know that the COVID considerations, excuse me, permitted us to use SEOG funds up to 100% as emergency funds. And so, what does that mean? That means that you don't have to take into consideration the normal chart of how you spend your SEOG. Normally, you would say, you would have it laid out where you could spend, you try to spend all your money on 0 EFC students, and then you award SEO. If you run out of SEO of 0 EFC students, then you move on to, I don't know, the next group if you want to, Pell eligible students, but not 0 EF students, for example. So anyways, that all gets suspended if you're going to spend this as emergency SEOG. So I know at my college, we ended up giving this emergency SEOG to several students who didn't have 0 EFCs to help them with additional expenses, emergency requests, things like that. There's no real right way of doing it, apparently. I mean, you could have an application, you could not have an application, you can award it to across the board, whatever you want to do, but you have the ability to spend your SEOG in that manner, which is nice. However, in order to track this properly, because they do ask this question on the FISAP, how much did you spend in SEOG as emergency SEOG, and how many students did you spend it on? I came up with another award code, which we used as FSEOE. And that allowed me then to be able to run like an FMGT report that shows me how many students received emergency SEOG and how many dollars were expended. And if you're going to do that, and if you have done that, just make sure you add that new award code to your setup on FFAP, which is your FISAP setup screen that you need to do before you do anything else when you start running these reports in Colleague. So it will include it when calculating your SEOG figures. And like any new code, you want to make sure you add that to FLTT as you would, so this stuff shows up automatically on your in-shed report and other reporting that's done to the system office. Okay, work study. Like it says here, most of the guidance for SEOG is the same as it is for work study in terms of transfers and carry forwards and carry backs. I talked about this before, like your June payroll that's paid in July. It can be part of your regular disbursement. So that's not even counting towards the summer enrollment figure or your 10% carry forward figure. So that could be part of your regular expenditure figures that you report on your FISAP. And just as a quick other reminder, of course, just as we talked about earlier, make sure you update that CWS earnings field on AIDE with the accurate amount of work study expended per student before you run PRDR, which will be used in this next section to report eligible campus-based recipients. The national emergency allowed us to suspend the need to place 7% of our dollars in community service jobs, and that is good now through the 21-22 year. This one was a waiver that expires at the end of the award year that begins after the date on which the federally declared national emergency related to COVID is rescinded. So we're in the award year now, and it's still under a national emergency. So we're at least going to have this requirement through 21-22. The question will be whether or not it's through 22-23. We don't know that yet. It'll depend on when the national emergency is ended. So in section K, there is a question about work-study disaster-affected students. This is referring to students who were paid work-study for not working because they couldn't work. I'm not sure. I know at GTCC we didn't do that in the 21-22 year. No, the 2021 year. Sorry. We did it in the 1920 year because that was at the beginning of the COVID emergency, and we literally shut down our campus like many of you did. And so we did continue paying work-study students through June 30th. But however, for this year, for 2021 and for 21-22, we did not pay students for not working. However, you did have the flexibility to do so. So if you did, this is where you would report how you did that and how much was expended in doing so. All right, so program summary. This is where you put those eligible recipients of campus-based funding broken out by income. And again, this is one of those things where it's probably not a good idea to run it wide open, although at least in this particular one, it's limited to the students who receive dollars in SEOG and work study. And so if you've got that all balanced, it should come out correctly, but it's still probably a good idea just to run this with a save list. So you could create a save list of students who received SEOG and or work study in order to make sure they're included. This one requires us to report on the FISAP in whole dollars, but as you are probably aware, if you've done this before, in Colleague, it comes out in pennies in your report. On PRDR, when you run that, you'll see pennies. So you have to go through and do round up, round down, round up, round down, whatever, to make those figures then come out to your total expended figure to make it work. So you'll just have to do a little finagling to make that come out the way you want it to. And the same is true for the less than full-time and the auto zero EFC students that are reported towards the bottom of that page, or that section, section 6. You'll again have to round up or round down. Okay, so that's the presentation part where I've gone through a series of slides, just going through some best practices and some quick tips on how to get through FISAP season. We do have some questions and answers. And let's go ahead and start on these now. And in the meantime, if you have other questions that you have, go ahead and put those in the chat. And Brenda, I think, will help me out with that and keep an eye on the chat and let me know what the questions are. And she and I will try to answer those. Or when we get to these few that we have as part of our presentation, you can also turn on your microphone. I'll let you know when we start that part. So one of the questions is, what should be included in Part 2, Section E, Assessments and Expenditures for State Grants and Scholarships? This should include all state grants and scholarships where we, GTCC, for example, my college, doesn't pick the recipients. So things like Targeted Assistance Program or less than half-time grants, those you would not count because we get to pick them. Areas where they're not picked by us and they're picked by the state instead would be things like your community college grant and your educational lottery, TAP, for the veterans, which is a state program. Those come to you with the recipients or the eligible recipients already noted to you, so you get to include those on this field. So how do we handle Pell checks that have not been cashed and will not expire before the FISAPs do? And that's more than just Pell. It'd be also things like SEOG. So keep in mind, even though you must submit this by October 1, you will have an opportunity all the way up to December 15th without any real problem at all being able to make an update to this figure, and you must do so by December 15th. Now, I just wait until that date to go ahead and make any adjustments because you do have to submit any adjustments with your president's signature. So I don't want to have to do that like every week, every time I start voiding checks that haven't been cashed. So I just give, I make sure I balance, I've reconciled, and then right on or around December 15th, if not a day or two before, I just make sure I go back in there and update anything that needs updating, like the Pell. But sometimes you may have to update your SEOG figures as well if you had uncashed SEOG checks. And so you can do that by December 15th and make sure you print out the signature page and submit with your president's signature as a follow-up. If you have to make changes after December 15th, it's not nearly as easy, but it is doable. but you do have to ask COD to reopen the year in order to do it. And so there are directions on how to do that in Volume 4, Chapter 4 of the handbook. Are we allowed to carry forward more than 10% of work study or SEOG to the 21-22 year? No, you're not. That part was not part of the waivers due to the national emergency. You can still only transfer forward 10%, but you are permitted to transfer up to 100% of your work study to SEOG, at least through the 2021 year. That was still a thing. So again, transfers of work study to SEOG and that emergency grant authority extend through the end of the payment period. That includes the last date of the national emergency. So for example, if that national emergency was ended today, that means you could still transfer work study and to SEOG in excess of over the 25% normal allowance. And you could use your emergency grant authority through then the end of the fall semester. But then that's when it would end. So we don't know if it's going to be for the whole 21-22 year because we don't know when the national emergency is going to end, but it would at least then carry through that payment period once it does get concluded. Okay. Are we exempt from the underuse penalty for the 2021 year because of COVID? No, unfortunately not. It was last year. For the 19-20 year, there was no penalty for underuse. But if you refer to the January 15th announcement that came out, you can still apply for a waiver, but that would be under like our normal circumstances where you apply for a waiver if you've underused your funds. So any underuse of funds for 2021 would possibly affect your 22-23 allocations. So keep that in mind. All right. Phew. So I got through that. So this is the part where if we have other questions, Brenda and I will certainly try to answer those. And if you'd like to turn on your microphone and ask your question that way rather than through the chat, that's okay too.
It looks like we've got a couple in the chat, and I'd like for us to address those before we ask our participants to turn on their mics and ask individual questions. The first one in the chat is from Brenda Long, and she's asking, where do we find the exception language regarding carry forward for federal work study funds?
Well, the exception, there isn't an exception to the 10%, and I just mentioned that, so it might have been that was her question, and I just mentioned there's no exception to that under the national emergency. If it's something other than 10% though, Brenda Long in this case, please come back to the chat and let us know if you were asking about a different sort of exemption.
In the chat is from Carolyn, and she's asking, what about FELS? And I think that's in reference to one of the prepared questions that we had, and as to whether or not we need to include that as under our state scholarships and or grant programs. And if I am incorrect in misstating, Carolyn, could you please clarify?
Well, if it is referring to whether or not you include it in the state grant and scholarship section, if we don't choose the student, then it gets included in that section, just like community college grant or lottery.
Okay. All right, next question is, does adding FSEOE to FFAP only impact running PRDR, or does it impact EAAP, that report as well? I'm asking because I already ran EEAP before I added FSEOE.
That's a lot of letters. You did really good with that, Brenda. No, it wouldn't impact your EAAP report because the EAAP report is only going to pull your eligible and enrolled applicants. It has nothing to do with recipients. So you were perfectly okay in doing what you did, but you're right. It was super important that you add that to FFAP before you ran PRDR for your SEOG and your SEOE, XYZ at 1, 2, 3.
Absolutely. All right, next question is, would you include NC Reach, FELS, and NC Child Care Grant for question 24 in section E?
Well, first of all, let me just remind you, the answers to these really don't matter. So don't get tied up with this. But I want to say that, and I actually have to go back and look, but I'm pretty sure I haven't been including REACH because that's actually a national program. It is administered through a state agency, but it's not, it's federal dollars as I recall. So I haven't been including them, but if someone would like to contradict me, that would be okay. And if you included them, it would be fine too, because no one's looking at that figure.
Okay, and I think that concludes the questions that are in the chat.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Either you want to turn your microphone or type one in. Either is
Lisa,
totally fine.
It looks like I may have missed something, and it looks like somebody has mentioned that they are in the process of sending money back for uncashed checks. And they've got a situation where someone received a small amount of Pell and NC Community College grant that leads to a refund amount. It's really not attributable to one program or the other. The question is, what is the order of return in this situation?
Was that submitted anonymously, or did Joey
No, it was
Trogdon submit
me.
that?
I just now read your email response. I'm sorry. I was out yesterday.
Thanks, Joey. Joey emails me this question, and I give him a response, and then I'm like, oh, now he's going to call me out in front of everybody. Okay.
I'm sorry.
Well, I gave him my opinion in case any of you were interested in it, and maybe Brenda, maybe if you have a different take on it, let me know. But I thought that was a good question, and I have had that happen a few times. My approach has always been that I would credit that check that was uncashed and voided. I would credit it back to the last thing applied to their account. So typically Pell gets applied first and then state grants. So I'd be basically crediting it back to the state grants. If it's, in our case, of course, if the student has loans, I always give the money back to loans first in order to reduce the amount of debt that the student would have. But if anyone has another take on that or read something, because I've never read what the answer to that is, and so that's just always been how I handled it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joey. Hope you enjoyed your day off, man.
No, I wasn't feeling too well. I took the day off.
Oh, bummer. Okay.
That's all right. No,
Hey,
I was kind of operating kind of like the same premise you were, but like you, I'd never read or seen anything about that or training, so I was just wanting to make sure I wasn't too crazy.
Well, that's
Anyway.
up for debate.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Hey, Lisa, it's Brenda Long. I hear you were trying to get me. I had to step away.
That's cool. You had asked a question in the chat about an exemption, and I assumed you meant an exception to the rule where you could transfer up to 10% to the new year.
Right.
Is that what you were asking?
Right. Is there an exemption to that, or?
There is not.
Okay. Okay. Just wanted to be certain.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm kind of in that boat too. I mean, I did my very, very best to spend my work study. I mean, this last year was a disaster for work study. I don't know if you guys experienced the same thing or not, but I had real trouble trying to spend mine. And so I transferred a whole bunch of it and used it as emergency SEOG to help summer students. But then there were some students who ended up not enrolling, or they did enroll and then dropped out before classes started. And so then I ended up having a bunch of money on hand. And it does exceed my 10%, not by a whole lot, but I'm transferring up to 10% forward, but that's about all I can do. And the rest of it will be, not spent. And
well, are you doing the reallocation form?
I didn't do the reallocation form, and I probably need to if it's not already too late for that. I haven't looked into that.
Yeah, I don't know what the deadline is on it, but we had trouble spending America Reads, America Counts. We couldn't get the students in the schools. So,
Mhm.
there is a exemption for that, right?
Yes, yes, you are
Okay.
exempted through 21-22 about your 7% community service and the other community service requirements under your reading or math or, well, all those other ones that they mentioned that you would need to place at least one student in to meet the requirement for. That's all exempted through the end of this academic year.
Good, good. Thank you.
We're
Yeah,
still
that did
able
make
to
life a little easier.
we're still able to move beyond the 25% over though, right? Due to all the emergency stuff.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, at least through the end of the period after the payment period after which the national emergency ends.
Okay.
Okay, are there any more questions? I'm not seeing any in the chat. You certainly can unmute yourselves and ask away.
Hey Lisa, it's Allison Scott at Rowan Cabarrus. I have a quick question for you.
Sure.
You on FAAP where you put the yes for maintaining work study, doesn't that typically open up on AIDE the right hand side where I can manually put in the amount?
Yes, the CWS earnings field.
So when I do that, for whatever reason, it's not working. Is there anything else that controls that? It's still yellow.
Oh, no, not that I'm aware of. We just worked on that yesterday at our campus, as a matter of fact, and that worked fine.
It's always worked for me in the past, but I'm wondering if it's is there a way that my business office has me blocked from access or something?
Allison, when you go to it, is it, when you go to change it from no to yes, is it yellow or white?
Let me look. I think it's white on that one. White. And I have it marked as yes, but when I go to AIDE, it's yellow.
I've never seen that either.
Yeah, that's weird. Like I said, we did it just yesterday, and I'm not familiar with anything in the business office side that would prevent that from occurring. I would recommend you submit a help desk ticket to Brandy, but luckily Brandy was just answering.
Well, I was going to say too, make sure when you're looking at A that you're in the right column, because sometimes I don't scroll far enough to the right, because if you're like me, I blow up my screen really large. Make sure you're not in the column for transmit money, and make sure you're in the column for the earnings.
Yeah. Yeah, good suggestion.
But
Okay,
if it doesn't work, put in a ticket. I can look at it or send it up either way.
Okay, thank you.
Lisa and Brenda, I just want to say great presentation this morning.
Thank you very much, Brandy.
And thank you for doing that.
Thank you for being on, Brandy. We appreciate you.
Absolutely. Well, Brenda, while we wait for more questions to come in, did you want to cover these next couple of slides?
Well, I can. These are just some important reminders. Again, make sure that you are reporting your Pell Grant disbursements that were made in 2021. And these will be your funds to report in Part 2, Section E on Field 23. And make sure that you're working with your business office to reconcile your G5 activity and any disbursements that you're making for work study earnings. Any funds that are drawn down from G5 should never exceed any reporting expenditures on the FISAP. If so, your school is going to be required to send these monies back. And you definitely want to keep track of any activities that could potentially impact what you've already paid out to a student versus what has been received by your institution. So please, please, please coordinate with your business office to make sure that those expenditures are matching. Check out volume 6 of the FSA handbook for any updates on the administrative cost allowances and the permissions that go with it, because a lot of times we don't know that we have received our administrative cost allowances, and there have always been questions about what we can use those funds for. And it's important to know that, you know, we are always skeptical about travel and training. Your administrative cost allowances that you're receiving for your campus-based programs as well as your federal Pell Grant can be used for such activities. For supplemental FISAP reporting instructions due to CARES and COVID, any emergency situations, updated guidance, and Lisa has mentioned this a time or two, is in a January 15th electronic announcement. And final reminder, not on the screen, but of course, make sure that you are not waiting until the last minute to complete your FISAP. Of course, it's due on October 1st, and that it is not a financial aid only report. And Lisa has mentioned that throughout the presentation, that it takes a team to get this done, and that team would include you, possibly your registrar's office, maybe admissions, and also maybe institutional effectiveness. Campus-based school relations contact. Make sure that you are, if you have any questions regarding the FISAP, that you are communicating, and you can certainly do it via email, Monday through Fridays from 8 a.m. Until 8 p.m. And the address is listed below for sending your FISAP in. You can use the standard mail, which may take a little bit longer. I call that the snail mail, and it's slower than a snail these days. Or either you may want to overnight your FISAP. Address information is listed for you. Lots of resources here for you all regarding setup. Any questions that you may have regarding colleague, please make sure that you are sending those tickets to our ServiceNow portal, and Brandy and her team will certainly make sure that they are addressed for you in a timely manner.
All right, Brenda, thank you very much. So we are coming up towards the end of the hour, but we do technically have a few more minutes. So if anyone else has thought of another question.
Looks like there's a question in the chat, Lisa, and I'm going to try to read it as best I can. My bifocals may not be focusing as they should. So
I feel
you can help me out, Donnie. It says this is the first year that we've included Con Ed awards on aid for reporting purposes. The business office said that our uncashed checks are all checks that were given to continuing education students. Will that affect the FISAP reporting since they are not curriculum students? I assume not, but wanted to be 100% sure.
You are right on the money, Donnie. You're right. There's nothing on the FISAP that would be linked to how we spent HERF money. Where that might become an issue is when we have to do our in-shed report. So you have a little extra time, I guess is what it boils down to get those taken care of. But it's not a need. You do not need to worry about that for your FISAP.
Okay. And one more question. Will the PowerPoint presentation be shared and or available in ServiceNow? The PowerPoint presentation was sent to you all about 30 minutes before the presentation, and yes, this is being recorded.
Okay, good questions.
Okay. Lots of thank yous. It looks like we've got about 5 minutes. Just do want to thank you guys, and also ask that you will provide any feedback that you may have regarding this presentation. If you will, send it directly to me. If you don't want to send it to me, you can certainly send it to my supervisor, Dr. J.W. Kelly. And I just want to put this plug out here for you all. If you will just let me know, we are considering for October a R2T4 webinar, and just let me know your thoughts about that if you think that's a good topic for us for next month. And also let me know of any future training suggestions that you may have. And Brandy has put in the chat that there will be some additional training on award categories that will hopefully help us with in-shed reporting. In-shed reporting is certainly coming up in the next couple months, so great opportunity for us to learn more, and I'm sure that Brandy will be in touch with us on when that training will be scheduled.
Okay, I think I heard someone asking a question, or they started to say something, so feel free. This is your time.
That was me, Lisa. I'm having some audio problems. This is Marlene at Sampson. And my question was, so when I'm doing the FISAP report, I transferred all of my work study because we couldn't place students here on campus.
Yep.
So it was okay that I transferred all of it to SEOG this year.
Yep.
And I spent it all except for the 5% admin for both of them.
Perfect.
So when I'm doing part 5, I haven't started loading any of it in. I've got it ready. You know, most of mine is going to be zeros except
yes.
for section A and 4B, 4A. So I guess every one of the exceptions it comes up with are I can't think of the word I'm looking for. I just put in there due to the national emergency situation, what you said earlier, and answer about that and just keep going.
Exactly right. Yeah. The only thing you're going to be putting on section 5 is that you're transferring, you know, the whole figure that you transferred to SEOG. Your expenditures for compensation are going to be 0. Your expenditures for community service are all going to be zeros. You will put your admin allowance here, but that's it. That's literally it. And so, yeah, you do. That's exactly right. And so when you answer the errors, you'll just reference the national emergency as the reason why you did it.
So I would put the admin part of the work study on part 5 and not included on the SEOG, just on the SEOG, include the admin for the SEOG by itself.
My bad. I said that wrong. No, you were right. No, because your admin should follow where you expended the money.
Okay. So really the only thing that I would have on part 5 would be whatever my authorization was and then what I transferred.
You got it.
Which is my case with everything. Okay.
You got it. Yep, cool.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Great presentation.
Thank you very much, and a good use of those exceptions there at your campus. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, 1 minute left, guys. If anyone has a last minute question, now's the time. Okay,
last minute questions, comments, concerns.
Yep. Well, if not, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you found this helpful, and happy FISAP season.
Absolutely. Happy FISAP season, and I hope that you all have a great rest of your day. And just remember that you are awesome, and I want to personally thank you for all that you do on your campuses.